On my 30th birthday, my father looked me straight in the eyes in front of 50 wealthy guests and told me he wished I was never born. My mother sipped her expensive champagne, and my sister laughed loudly at my humiliation. They thought they had finally broken my spirit. They thought I was just a failed college dropout without any future. The next morning, I packed my bags, withdrew all my savings, and executed a financial freeze that would destroy their entire legacy permanently. Before I tell you exactly how a $50 million click changed our lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives. The jazz band played softly in the manicured gardens of my family estate in Atlanta. The golden string lights illuminated the pathways where guests gathered. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated with silver trays of expensive horse devours and sparkling water. I stood near the stone patio, adjusting the simple black dress I had bought off a clearance rack. The fabric felt rough against my skin. My father Calvin grabbed my right forearm with a grip like a metal vise. His sudden appearance startled me. He pulled me roughly away from the crowd and shoved me into his mahogany-paneled library. The heavy oak doors shut with a loud thud, cutting off the music from outside. The air inside smelled of cigars and leather. He tossed a thick stack of legal documents onto the center of his massive wooden desk. "Sign it right now, Jordan." His voice carried the same dictatorial tone he used on his warehouse employees. I looked down at the paperwork. The bold heading at the top read, "Cross-Collateralization Agreement." He wanted to leverage my small two-bedroom apartment in West End to secure a bridge loan for his failing logistics company. I looked back at his demanding expression. Absolutely not. His face flushed a deep, angry red. "You owe this family everything. My supply chain business paid for the food in your mouth. Now the company is facing a temporary liquidity issue, and you are going to do your part to save it." I stepped back from the desk. "Your company is hemorrhaging cash because you refuse to modernize your shipping routes and update your technology. I am not risking the only property I own to patch a sinking ship. You bought that apartment with money you saved while living under my roof." He slammed his heavy fist on the desk, making the brass lamp rattle. "You will sign this paper, or I will make sure you never get a single dime of your grandfather trust fund." I crossed my arms tight against my chest. "Keep the trust fund. I am not signing away my home." Calvin grabbed his crystal wine glass from the edge of the desk. He hurled it violently against the stone fireplace. The crystal shattered into 100 jagged pieces, scattering across the expensive Persian rug. He grabbed my wrist again, his fingernails digging deeply into my skin. He yanked me toward the heavy doors and threw them wide open. He dragged me out of the library and back onto the brightly lit garden patio. The jazz band abruptly stopped playing their instruments. 50 heads turned in our direction instantly. Atlanta business tycoons, socialites, and local politicians stared at us in complete silence. Calvin released my wrist and shoved me forward. I stumbled but caught my balance before hitting the hard stone pavers. "Look at her," Calvin shouted, pointing a rigid finger directly at my face. "Look at this massive disappointment." The guests exchanged shocked whispers and stared at my simple clothes. I stood perfectly still, keeping my gaze locked on his furious eyes. "You think you are so smart, refusing to help your own blood." He stepped closer, his voice echoing across the silent garden. "You rejected medical school. You rejected our long-standing family traditions. You run around the city claiming you are building some useless tech startup. You are a failure, Jordan. You have always been a failure." My chest tightened, but I kept my breathing steady and even. I refused to give him the satisfaction of a visible emotional reaction. "This is my legacy." He gestured wildly toward the sprawling mansion behind him. "I built an empire from the ground up, and my youngest daughter will not even sign a simple piece of paper to support her own flesh and blood. You are a disgrace to my name." I opened my mouth to respond, but he cut me off immediately. "I wish you were never born." The words struck like a physical blow to the stomach. The absolute silence in the garden amplified the intense cruelty of his statement. No one moved. No one spoke a single word of defense. The elite members of our community simply watched the spectacle with morbid curiosity. I looked at the man who had provided my genetic code, but had never acted like a real father. I realized in that exact moment that I owed him absolutely nothing. He had severed the final thread holding us together. My mother Brenda stepped forward from the crowd of silent guests. She adjusted her designer silk wrap and looked at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. "Your father is right, Jordan." She stood next to Calvin, reinforcing his aggressive attack. "You dropped out of medical school to play on your computer. You threw away a respected career to chase garbage ideas. We gave you every opportunity and you squandered them all." My sister Monique walked up next. She held a glass of champagne in one hand and rested the other on her hip. She wore a custom gown that cost more than my entire vehicle. "You really are pathetic." Monique laughed, a cold, sharp sound that cut through the tension. "You show up here in that cheap dress and insult the people who gave you life. You are just jealous because you will never achieve anything real in your miserable life." Her husband Spencer stepped out from behind her. The white investment broker wore a smug grin that made my stomach turn. He reached into the inner pocket of his perfectly tailored suit jacket. He pulled out his luxury checkbook and an expensive gold pen. He scribbled something, quickly tore the check from the pad and tossed it onto the ground right at my feet. "There is $500. Spencer said, his voice dripping with intense condescension. "Pick it up, call a taxi, and scurry back to your ghetto neighborhood. Leave the successful people alone today. You are ruining the aesthetic of our party." Monique giggled loudly and leaned against Spencer. Brenda nodded in complete approval of the humiliation. Calvin crossed his arms and glared at me, waiting for me to break down and cry in front of everyone. They stood together, a united front of arrogance and toxic behavior. They expected me to crumble under the weight of their judgment. They expected me to snatch the check and run away in absolute shame. I looked down at the white check resting on the stone pavers. It fluttered slightly in the evening breeze. I lifted my right foot and brought the heel of my shoe down hard. I crushed the crisp paper into the dirt and twisted my foot, grinding it until the paper tore into useless shreds. I reached behind my neck and unclasped the pearl necklace I was wearing. It was the only gift Calvin had ever given me for my 15th birthday. I pulled the pearls off and threw them straight at his chest. The necklace hit his lapel and clattered to the ground, scattering white beads across the patio. The tiny pearls rolled into the grass. "This is the last time you will ever see me bow my head." I turned my back on my family and walked away. I strode through the manicured garden, out the heavy iron gates, and into the warm Atlanta night. I did not shed a single tear. The air felt heavy with humidity, but my lungs felt completely clear for the first time in years. The next morning, I stood in the middle of my empty apartment. I had packed my bags and cleared out my space. I opened my laptop and logged into the highly secure internal portal of Horizon Equity. I navigated to the active acquisitions dashboard. I located the file containing the massive debt obligations of Calvin Logistics Company. I moved the cursor to the execute button and clicked confirm. A $50 million financial freeze order went into immediate effect. I closed the laptop and smiled. I picked up my suitcase and walked out the door, leaving my old life behind permanently. My family thought I was a penniless dropout. They had no idea they had just declared war on their biggest creditor. Monday morning arrived with the stifling heat typical of late southern summers. Calvin adjusted his custom-tailored silk tie as he walked through the heavy glass doors of the largest national bank in downtown Atlanta. Spencer walked a half-step behind him, carrying a leather briefcase that held the future of the family logistics empire. They were there to sign the final disbursement papers for a $20 million commercial loan. The marble floors echoed with their confident footsteps. Calvin expected the usual royal treatment. He expected the branch manager to greet him with fresh coffee and an obsequious smile. Instead, they were left waiting in a sterile glass conference room for nearly 20 minutes. Spencer checked his gold watch, tapping his foot impatiently. He had structured this debt consolidation himself, and his massive broker commission depended on this single signature. The heavy glass door finally opened. The branch manager walked in, but he carried no coffee and no paperwork. His face was the color of dirty chalk, and a visible bead of sweat rolled down his temple. Calvin stood up immediately, preparing to scold the man for his extreme tardiness. Before Calvin could utter a single word of reprimand, the manager held up a trembling hand. The manager stated that he had terrible news. The loan underwriting had been pulled. Calvin stared at him in complete disbelief, demanding to know what kind of sick joke the bank was playing. The manager swallowed hard and explained that it was not a joke at all. The $20 million loan was completely canceled effective immediately. Spencer slammed his hands on the glass table, demanding an explanation. The manager stepped back defensively and delivered the crushing blow. He revealed that Calvin no longer had any collateral. An anonymous private equity fund had executed a hostile financial freeze on the entire corporate credit line of the logistics company overnight. Every single operating account associated with Calvin was now locked. Calvin felt his chest tighten as the reality of the situation crashed into him. Without that $20 million lifeline, his trucking fleet would not be able to buy fuel by the end of the week. The bank manager refused to make eye contact as he asked them to vacate the premises, immediately stating that the bank could no longer do business with a company under active financial embargo. The interior of Calvin's luxury sedan felt like a suffocating cage as they drove away from the bank. Spencer sat in the passenger seat with his mind racing in a state of absolute panic. He was the chief financial broker for the family business. If the logistics company defaulted on its massive debts, Spencer would face intense investigations, and his own personal assets would be seized. He needed a scapegoat, and he needed one immediately to direct Calvin away from his own financial mismanagement. Spencer cleared his throat and looked over at his father-in-law, whose face was rigid with explosive fury. Spencer fabricated a lie on the spot. He told Calvin that he had received a tip from a junior underwriter at the bank earlier that morning. He claimed that an angry, disgruntled family member had called the banking executives directly. Spencer spun a wild story, insisting that Jordan had used her petty startup connections to file defamatory reports about the company financial health. He told Calvin that Jordan had submitted fake documents claiming the logistics company was insolvent just to ruin the loan approval out of pure spite for what happened at the birthday party. Calvin slammed his hands against the leather steering wheel with enough force to shake the entire vehicle. The veins in his neck bulged as he absorbed the venomous lie. He believed it instantly because it perfectly fit his twisted narrative of his youngest daughter being a bitter, jealous failure. He growled that he had given her everything and she dared to bite the hand that fed her. Spencer nodded eagerly, fueling the fire. He added that Jordan had probably begged her ghetto friends to spam the bank fraud department with anonymous tips. Calvin swore loudly in the confined space of the car. He vowed that he would not just cut her out of the family, but that he would completely crush her miserable existence. He promised to make sure she could never secure a job or an apartment in the city of Atlanta ever again. His pride had been wounded in front of his wealthy peers on Saturday, and now his financial lifeblood was threatened on Monday. He steered the heavy car sharply, turning it toward the industrial district where he knew Jordan rented her cheap office space. Monique had insisted on coming along when Calvin called her, demanding she meet them to confront her useless sister. She wore a pristine white designer suit and held a scented handkerchief to her nose as they stepped onto the cracked pavement of the rundown industrial park. The brick building looked like a relic from a forgotten decade. Calvin marched furiously toward the main entrance with Monique trailing behind, complaining about the smell of the neighborhood. They fully intended to march into Jordan's tiny rented office and slap her across the face for daring to interfere with the family money. Calvin pushed open the heavy metal door, expecting to find his daughter sitting at a cheap plastic desk. Instead, a burly security guard stepped directly into his path, blocking the entrance to the main hallway. Calvin ordered the guard to step aside, demanding to see Jordan immediately. The security guard simply crossed his massive arms and let out a dry, cynical laugh. He looked Calvin up and down with obvious amusement. The guard informed them that they were wasting their time. He announced that Jordan had completely moved her operations out of this dump a week ago. Monique rolled her eyes and demanded to know which miserable rat hole her sister had crawled into next. The guard smirked and told them she did not crawl anywhere. He revealed that Jordan had just finalized a cash purchase for a 50-story glass high-rise right in the center of the downtown financial district. Calvin froze. His mind refused to process the concept of his failure daughter buying premium commercial real estate in cash. Before he could accuse the guard of lying, his cell phone began to ring loudly in his pocket. He answered it, barking his name roughly. The voice on the other end belonged to a senior agent from a premier debt collection firm. The agent did not offer pleasantries. He coldly informed Calvin that his massive suburban mansion had just been targeted for immediate foreclosure proceedings. The cross-collateral loans Calvin had taken out to support his lavish lifestyle had defaulted because his corporate accounts were frozen. The agent stated that Calvin had less than a month to vacate the premises before the locks were changed. The phone slipped from Calvin's trembling hand and clattered against the dirty concrete floor. Desperation is a powerful catalyst for terrible decisions. Calvin turned to Spencer with wild, unhinged eyes. The patriarchal facade had completely crumbled, leaving only a terrified old man facing total ruin. He grabbed Spencer by the collar of his expensive suit and ordered him to drain the family backup trust fund immediately. This trust was a multi-million-dollar safety net set up decades ago, designed only to be touched in the event of absolute catastrophe. Spencer nodded, his hands shaking slightly, but a triumphant smirk slowly crept onto his face. He assured his father-in-law that he had already anticipated this exact emergency. Spencer reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick legal document. He proudly displayed a power of attorney bearing Jordan's signature. He bragged that he had forged her signature weeks ago just in case he needed to bypass her legal consent to access the pooled family assets. He thought he was a genius for outsmarting the system. Spencer rushed straight to the luxury office of the senior attorney who managed the family trust. He slapped the forged power of attorney onto the polished mahogany desk, demanding an immediate wire transfer of all available liquid assets to his personal account. The elderly attorney picked up the document and adjusted his reading glasses. He looked at the forged signature and then looked up at Spencer with an expression of deep pity. The attorney slowly shook his head and slid the paper back across the desk. He informed Spencer that the document was completely useless. Spencer demanded to know why, slamming his fist on the desk. The attorney leaned back in his leather chair and folded his hands together. He stated clearly that the backup trust fund no longer existed. The entire account holding millions of dollars had been completely emptied and legally closed out exactly 3 days ago. Spencer practically flew down the highway, weaving recklessly through the heavy Atlanta traffic. His mind spun a frantic web of lies to save his own skin. If Calvin found out that he had tried to forge documents to steal the family money, his life would be over. His luxury sedan screeched into the circular driveway of the sprawling estate. He burst through the heavy mahogany front doors of the mansion, gasping for air and sweating completely through his expensive dress shirt. Brenda, Calvin, and Monique were already waiting in the formal living room, expecting him to return with good news about their financial rescue. The room was decorated in pristine white and gold, a stark contrast to the dark mood settling over the family. Instead of offering reassurance, Spencer threw his leather briefcase onto the expensive marble floor and pointed a trembling finger toward the city skyline. He shouted that Jordan was a criminal. He claimed he went to the trust office to secure their emergency funds, but discovered Jordan had already drained every single penny. He spun a highly detailed tale of absolute betrayal, playing on their pre-existing hatred for her. He told them Jordan had stolen the family money and fled like a common thief, leaving them all to drown in a sea of corporate debt. Brenda gasped loudly and pressed her manicured hands against her pearl necklace. She immediately convened an emergency family meeting right there in the center of the room. Monique collapsed onto the velvet sofa and began to sob uncontrollably. She played the perfect victim, crying that Jordan had always been deeply jealous of her perfect marriage and her perfect life. She wailed that her younger sister had stolen her future and ruined her chance at happiness before her baby was even born. Calvin paced the floor like a caged animal, his face turned a dangerous shade of purple. He declared that Jordan had finally crossed the line of no return. Brenda agreed wholeheartedly, stating that they needed to teach the ungrateful girl a permanent lesson about family loyalty. They reached a unanimous family decision without a second thought. They would call the police immediately. They planned to file a formal report for grand larceny and severe financial fraud. Calvin wanted a warrant issued for her arrest before sunset. He wanted to see his own daughter humiliated, ripped from her new office, and led away in tight handcuffs. He wanted the entire world to know she was a complete failure and a deceitful thief. Less than an hour later, a heavy, purposeful knock echoed through the grand foyer of the mansion. Brenda hurried to open the door, expecting to find the local police officers they had just called to take their official report. Two uniformed officers were indeed standing on the wide stone porch, but the person walking confidently right between them was not a detective. It was Jordan. She wore a razor-sharp tailored charcoal suit that commanded absolute authority in the space. Her posture was flawless, her chin held high. Walking right beside her was Harrison, her formidable personal attorney. His expression was completely calm, but his eyes carried an unmistakable warning. Brenda stepped back in sheer shock, unable to process the sight of her designated scapegoat daughter arriving with police escorts instead of running from them in terror. Calvin heard the commotion and stormed into the foyer, expecting to see his daughter in tears. When he saw Jordan standing there looking like an absolute professional executive, his rage boiled over. He completely lost his mind, forgetting the presence of the law. He lunged forward with his fists clenched, fully intending to strike her across the face and drag her out of his house by her hair. He screamed that she was a dirty thief who had ruined his legacy. The two police officers immediately stepped in front of Jordan. They blocked Calvin with their bodies and sternly ordered him to back down or face immediate arrest for physical assault. Calvin froze, his chest heaving heavily as he stared at his daughter over the broad shoulders of the officers. Jordan did not flinch. She did not take a single step backward to protect herself. She stared him down with a gaze as cold as winter ice, holding all the power in the room. Jordan walked past her father and stepped directly into the formal dining room. The rest of the toxic family followed her in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the shift in dynamics. She reached into her sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a thick bank statement stamped with a red official seal. She slammed the document onto the center of the polished dining table. The loud smack made Monique jump in her seat. Jordan calmly instructed them to read the paperwork. She explained the harsh reality they had conveniently ignored for years. The money in that trust fund never belonged to the family business or to Calvin. It was money left exclusively to her by her late grandfather, because he knew exactly how greedy they were. Calvin had used shady legal loopholes and predatory wealth managers to freeze her access to those funds when she turned 18. He had kept her own money hostage to control her choices and force her compliance. Jordan simply used her legitimate legal authority and her new financial power to release her own assets. There was no theft because the money was always legally hers. Calvin stared at the red bank seal, completely speechless, his entire narrative destroyed. Then Harrison stepped forward and took command of the room. The attorney pulled a different folder from his tailored jacket. He looked directly at Spencer, who was sweating profusely in the corner of the dining room. Harrison presented a certified handwriting analysis report, along with a copy of a legal form. He revealed that Spencer had submitted a forged power of attorney to the trust office just hours ago, attempting to drain the account himself. He stated clearly that forging a signature to access millions of dollars is a severe federal felony. The police officers turned their attention straight to Spencer, placing their hands near their utility belts. All the color drained from Spencer's face. He looked like he was about to pass out right on the expensive Persian rug. Brenda panicked completely. The thought of her golden son-in-law being arrested in her own living room was too much for her fragile social ego to handle. She grabbed her cell phone and immediately called a state senator she played tennis with every Tuesday morning. She begged for a political favor, weeping about a terrible family misunderstanding and a minor clerical error. The senator made a swift call to the police captain, and the officers reluctantly agreed to hold off on arresting Spencer right that second, pending a more formal investigation by the Financial Fraud Department. They stepped back, giving the family a very temporary breathing room. Calvin used this brief moment to try and regain his lost power over his daughter. He pointed his trembling finger at the front door and kicked Jordan out of his house. He screamed that she had not won anything yet, and that she was still a massive disappointment. He loudly declared that he was hosting a massive fundraising gala the very next night at their exclusive country club. He boasted that all the elite millionaires in Atlanta would be in attendance to support him. He promised he would secure new investors, save his logistics company, and completely destroy her miserable little startup in the process. Jordan did not argue with his delusions. She simply turned around and walked out the front doors with perfect grace, leaving them in their own mess. Once they were safely outside the mansion gates, she looked over at Harrison and smiled a genuinely chilling smile. She told her attorney to execute a complete buyout of the country club ownership shares that very night. She wanted to own the exact ground they walked on by tomorrow evening. The crystal chandeliers of the elite Atlanta Country Club cast a golden glow over the lavish ballroom where hundreds of wealthy guests mingled. Calvin and his family worked the room like absolute royalty holding court among the city elite. Brenda paraded proudly in a custom sequined gown, stopping at every single table to brag to her wealthy friends. She loudly boasted about the massive new expansion of their supply chain company, projecting an image of total financial invincibility. She laughed her practiced high-pitched laugh, completely ignoring the harsh reality of the foreclosure notice currently sitting on her kitchen counter. Spencer prowled the edges of the grand ballroom, sweating profusely inside his designer tuxedo. He desperately tailed the local billionaires and hedge fund managers, cornering them near the open bars. He pitched highly aggressive offers to sell off chunks of company stock, promising ridiculous returns to anyone who would inject cash to save their sinking ship. Every detail of their public performance was perfectly staged to project absolute power and success. Calvin stood near the main entrance receiving handshakes and warm congratulations from oblivious business partners. He looked incredibly smug, believing his temporary reprieve from the police was a permanent victory. He truly thought he had successfully banished his troublesome youngest daughter from his kingdom forever. They were hosting this extravagant event, on credit they no longer possessed, drinking expensive champagne they could not actually afford. The entire evening was a desperate illusion held together entirely by arrogance and toxic lies. Spencer continued to whisper frantic promises into the ears of wealthy investors, trying to secure the capital needed to cover his fraudulent tracks. Brenda continued to spin wild tales of massive corporate acquisitions and new international shipping routes. The elite guests swallowed the lies, completely unaware that the family empire was hollow and rotting from the inside out. They smiled and nodded, believing they were in the presence of greatness. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom suddenly swung wide open. The polite chatter near the entrance died down in an instant. Jordan stepped through the doorway. She walked right through the main entrance with her head held high and her shoulders back. She wore a stunning emerald green silk dress that draped perfectly over her frame, radiating a quiet but absolute authority. A senior club manager walked respectfully by her side, personally escorting her to a reserved table near the very front of the stage. She was not an uninvited crasher. She was an honored VIP guest, invited directly by the club ownership. The face of Calvin turned a dangerous shade of purple the exact moment he spotted her. The veins in his neck throbbed violently, as he watched his banished daughter command the undivided attention of the entire room. He took a furious step forward, intending to drag her out, but Monique beat him to it. Monique marched swiftly across the polished marble floor, gripping a full glass of vintage champagne. Her eyes burned with deep, toxic jealousy. She purposefully swerved directly into the path of Jordan and violently jerked her right hand. Monique let out a loud, fake gasp of surprise that echoed clearly through the sudden silence of the crowd. She covered her mouth with her manicured hand and sneered. She told Jordan to look at what she did to her only nice outfit. The voice of Monique was sickly sweet but laced with pure venom. She stated that Jordan really should not have sneaked in here. She declared that this was an exclusive charity gala for people who actually have money to donate and not for broke college dropouts trying to score a free meal. She mocked her sister, telling her to go back to the kitchen and ask the staff for some leftover scraps. The surrounding guests shifted uncomfortably, waiting for an explosive physical reaction. Calvin watched from a few feet away, a cruel smile forming on his lips as he waited for his youngest daughter to break down in tears and run away in profound shame. Jordan did not cry. She did not yell or raise her hand to strike back. She simply looked down at the ruined silk and then looked directly into the frantic, jealous eyes of her sister. Jordan offered a calm, serene smile, remaining completely unfazed by the public attack. She stood her ground with an elegance that made Monique look like a petty, ignorant child throwing a tantrum. The emerald fabric clung to her like armor, and the stain only served as a testament to her unbreakable composure. The grand ballroom lights dimmed slightly, signaling the start of the evening presentations. Spencer quickly rushed to the front of the room and stepped up to the polished wooden podium. He tapped the microphone and cleared his throat, demanding the attention of the wealthy crowd. He gripped the edges of the podium tightly, trying to project the image of a highly successful financial broker. He welcomed the guests and immediately launched into a passionate, rehearsed speech about family legacy and corporate resilience. He boldly claimed that the logistics company had recently faced some minor internal challenges. He blatantly hinted that certain incompetent and jealous family members had tried to sabotage their collective success out of pure spite. He looked directly at Jordan when he said it, making sure the entire room followed his gaze to the woman in the stained green dress. The elite guests whispered among themselves, judging her silently. But Spencer quickly pivoted, his tone changing from victim to victor. He raised his voice and announced proudly that their company had not only survived these petty attacks, but had emerged much stronger than ever before. He threw his hand into the air and loudly declared that they had just secured a massive, historic merger. He told the stunned crowd that a highly exclusive investment fund called Horizon Equity had recognized their immense market value. Spencer bragged that Horizon Equity was injecting a staggering $30 million in liquid capital into their business effective immediately. He promised the audience that this merger would solidify their family empire for the next century, ensuring unmatched prosperity. The ballroom erupted in thunderous applause. Wealthy investors clapped and cheered for the miraculous corporate turnaround. Calvin stood at the front table, puffing out his chest with immense pride. He glared at Jordan with absolute unhinged contempt. His eyes screamed that he had finally won, and she was nothing but dirt beneath his shoes. Brenda wiped a fake tear of joy from her cheek while Monique clapped loudly beside her husband. They genuinely believed their own lies. They believed this phantom investment fund had just handed them a golden ticket to unlimited wealth and ultimate power. They were standing proudly on the peak of their own arrogance, completely blind to the inescapable trap they had just locked themselves inside. Jordan calmly reached over to the nearest banquet table and picked up a crisp white linen napkin. She dabbed gracefully at the spilled wine on her emerald dress, taking her time while the thunderous applause continued to echo loudly around her. She dropped the soiled napkin onto a silver tray and began to walk forward. She did not run or rush her movements. Her heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor, cutting straight through the fading cheers of the crowd. The wealthy guests parted instinctively as she moved straight toward the front of the ballroom, radiating quiet power. The arrogant smile on the face of Calvin vanished instantly as he realized she was not walking toward the exit doors. as he had expected. His face twisted into a mask of pure fury and confusion. Spencer gripped the edges of the wooden podium, his eyes widening in sudden raw panic as Jordan easily climbed the 3 small steps onto the main stage. Her presence demanded total submission from the room. Before Spencer could utter a single word or raise a hand to stop her, Jordan reached out and snatched the heavy microphone right out of his sweating hand. Hundreds of shocked guests fell into absolute dead silence. They stared in profound disbelief as the disgraced daughter took total command of the entire room. Jordan looked out over the sea of wealthy investors and then turned her piercing gaze directly onto her brother-in-law. She told him it was a wonderful speech. Her voice was crystal clear and dangerously calm, echoing powerfully off the high ceilings of the elite country club. She stated that he had painted a truly beautiful picture of corporate success and family unity for everyone here tonight. She acknowledged that he made them believe in his grand vision of wealth and prosperity, but she added that he forgot to mention one very minor detail to all these lovely people. She declared loudly that he forgot to read the fine print in that merger agreement he was so eager to sign. The wealthy investors in the front row leaned forward in their velvet chairs, their eyes darting back and forth between the sweating broker and the commanding woman in green. Harrison, her brilliant attorney, stood silently near the back entrance, holding a thick leather briefcase filled with federal indictments and foreclosure notices. The trap had been perfectly set, and the bait had been swallowed whole. Jordan stood perfectly still on the raised wooden stage. The heavy silence in the ballroom felt thick enough to suffocate the wealthy guests. She raised her left hand and snapped her fingers once. The massive projector screen behind her instantly flickered to life. The bright white light illuminated the shocked faces of the Atlanta elite. A highly detailed business registration profile filled the enormous screen. The bold black letters at the very top clearly read Horizon Equity. The wealthy crowd stared at the corporate documents displaying the massive financial power of the mysterious investment fund. Jordan directed their attention to the bottom of the glowing screen. The executive leadership roster was displayed in massive, unmissable font. The title of founder and chief executive officer sat right next to a single name. That name was Jordan. A collective gasp echoed through the massive ballroom. Hundreds of millionaires and politicians inhaled sharply as the impossible truth hit them simultaneously. The disgraced runaway daughter was actually the ruthless corporate titan who had just seized total control of the room. Calvin stared at the giant screen with his mouth hanging wide open. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty wet ash. His knees buckled under his own weight as his mind short-circuited. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the polished marble floor. His broad shoulders slammed violently into a catered banquet table. Crystal champagne flutes tipped over and shattered onto the ground in a cascading wave of destruction. The sharp sound of breaking glass snapped the elite crowd out of their paralyzed trance. Brenda let out a high-pitched shriek and covered her face with her trembling hands. Monique stood completely frozen, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The entire family illusion was being publicly dismantled piece by piece under the bright stage lights. Jordan looked down at her father, struggling to keep his balance against the ruined banquet table. She did not offer a hand to help him up. She simply watched the arrogant patriarch realize that his ultimate corporate savior was actually the very daughter he had continuously abused and discarded. The sheer magnitude of her secret wealth hovered over the room like a physical weight, crushing the massive egos of the toxic family who had foolishly cast her out. Jordan gripped the microphone firmly and began to speak. Her voice carried absolute authority across the silent ballroom. She instructed the confused investors to carefully read the actual documents they were so eager to celebrate. She explained that there was absolutely no merger happening tonight or any other night. She announced that the failing logistics company was the primary target of a deeply calculated hostile takeover. The extravagant room fell into a terrified hush as she exposed the entire brutal truth to the public. Jordan revealed that she had spent the last 3 years quietly building her financial empire while her family mocked her startup dreams. She told the wealthy crowd that she had created a highly complex web of anonymous subsidiary companies. She used those untraceable shell corporations to systematically buy up every single piece of bad debt that Calvin had irresponsibly generated. She purchased his outstanding corporate loans and his high-interest truck leases. She aggressively acquired the toxic mortgages he had taken out to fund his incredibly lavish lifestyle. She explained that Calvin constantly refused to modernize his fleet and hemorrhaged cash for years hiding his massive corporate losses behind fake smiles and expensive country club memberships. Jordan stated that she had essentially become the sole absolute creditor for the entire logistics empire without him ever knowing her true identity. She declared that Horizon Equity now legally owned every single truck, every warehouse, and every shipping route associated with his failing business. The wealthy investors in the audience began to edge away from the family table. They recognized a rapidly sinking ship, and none of them wanted to be pulled under by the toxic debt Calvin carried. Calvin tried to speak, but his voice emerged as a weak, pathetic croak. He could not comprehend the sheer scale of the financial operation his youngest daughter had orchestrated right beneath his nose. Jordan exposed the final brutal reality to the stunned crowd. She announced that the $30 million was never an investment designed to save his company. It was the exact price she paid to completely liquidate his corporate structure and acquire the physical assets for her own expanding tech enterprise. She had bought his entire life work for pennies on the dollar. The mighty logistics empire Calvin had built was officially dead, and Jordan held the only key to the corporate graveyard. Jordan turned her cold gaze directly toward the podium where Spencer stood frozen in absolute terror. She pointed a rigid finger at the smug white broker who had thrown a $500 check at her feet just a few days ago. She announced to the crowd that the hostile takeover was incredibly easy because she had a desperate inside man making all the wrong moves. Jordan exposed Spencer as a greedy amateur who had personally driven the final nail into the family coffin. She revealed that Spencer had been terrified of losing his massive broker commission when the original bank loan failed earlier that week. He needed to find alternative funding instantly to save his own fragile reputation and avoid a massive federal financial audit. Jordan explained that Spencer approached Horizon Equity begging for a corporate lifeline. He was so incredibly arrogant and so eager for unchecked power that he never bothered to investigate the actual ownership of the private equity fund. He happily signed the incredibly aggressive loan agreements without running them through a competent legal review. Jordan raised her voice so every single person in the back of the room could hear the fatal mistake. She announced that Spencer had secretly pledged Calvin massive suburban mansion as cross-collateral for the emergency loan. He had also quietly leveraged the entire retirement fund belonging to Brenda to secure the temporary cash flow. Spencer had blindly agreed to hidden clauses that allowed Horizon Equity to seize all pledged personal assets the very second the logistics company missed a single scheduled payment. Jordan stated that the company had officially defaulted yesterday afternoon. She looked down at Monique, who was now sobbing hysterically on the marble floor. Jordan told her sister that her perfect husband had just personally signed away her entire family legacy. He had traded their generational wealth for a temporary illusion of success and a quick payout. Spencer gripped his perfectly styled hair and began to hyperventilate loudly into the microphone. He realized he had just handed Jordan the absolute legal right to rip the roof from over their heads. He had destroyed the very family he married into because his own blinding arrogance had led him straight into the trap she had so perfectly set. Spencer went completely pale and his legs began to shake violently behind the wooden podium. The heavy doors at the back of the ballroom burst open for a second time. 4 tall men wearing dark windbreakers with thick yellow letters across the back marched down the center aisle. The bold letters clearly spelled out FBI. The federal agents completely ignored the whispering crowd and walked straight onto the main stage. They approached Spencer, who was now openly weeping and gasping for air. The lead agent informed Spencer that he was under immediate arrest for severe federal bank fraud and malicious wire tampering. They forcefully pulled his shaking arms behind his back and secured his wrists in heavy metal handcuffs. The sharp click of the steel locks echoed loudly through the microphone. Calvin suddenly snapped out of his shock and lunged forward. His face was twisted into a tight mask of pure desperation and unhinged rage. He screamed at the top of his lungs, demanding that the agents release his son-in-law. He turned his venomous anger toward Jordan, pointing a violently shaking finger right at her face. He roared that she had absolutely no legal right to steal his magnificent home or his company. He shouted that he would hire the best attorneys in the entire state to sue her for malicious asset theft and corporate sabotage. He declared that she was a filthy monster who belonged in a dark prison cell for destroying her own flesh and blood. Jordan looked away from her screaming father and locked eyes with Harrison, who stood holding the final execution documents. She smiled a calm, victorious smile. She simply nodded her head, giving her attorney the silent order to deliver the ultimate crushing blow. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of the sprawling suburban estate. The massive iron gates stood wide open, a lingering consequence of the chaotic early departure of catering staff from the disastrous gala the night before. Inside the house, the atmosphere was heavy and suffocating. Calvin sat behind the massive mahogany desk in his private study, staring blankly at the dark wood grain. His mind was still spinning from the total public humiliation he had suffered at the hands of his own flesh and blood. The doorbell chimed, loudly echoing through the silent halls, but he did not move to answer it. A few moments later, the heavy oak doors of his study swung open without a simple knock. Jordan stood in the doorway, radiating absolute power. Harrison, her towering attorney, stood silently at her right shoulder, holding a thick leather portfolio. Jordan wore a charcoal gray suit with a crisp white shirt, her expression completely devoid of any familial warmth. She walked directly to the center of the room and stopped right in front of the desk. Calvin slowly looked up, his bloodshot eyes burning with pure venom. He demanded to know how she got past the security gate and ordered her to leave his property immediately. Jordan did not utter a single word of greeting. She reached into her sleek briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of heavy legal paper. She slammed the document flat onto the desk right over his trembling hands. The sound cracked like a whip in the quiet room. Jordan leaned forward, resting her palms on the cool wood. She instructed him to read the top line very carefully. It was a formal 30-day notice of eviction. Calvin stared at the bold black letters, his brain refusing to accept the reality of the words printed on the page. Jordan explained the brutal mechanics of his downfall with chilling precision. She stated that when Spencer recklessly signed the emergency bridge loan with Horizon Equity, he had desperately used this exact mansion as collateral. The paperwork contained immediate forfeiture clauses tied directly to the corporate default. Since the logistics company missed its catastrophic payment yesterday afternoon, the cross-collateralization protocol was triggered automatically. The sprawling estate no longer belonged to Calvin. The house, the land, and every piece of expensive furniture inside were now the legal property of Horizon Equity. She looked down at the defeated man who had tormented her for decades. She informed him that he had exactly 30 days to pack up his miserable life and vacate her property before she sent federal marshals to drag him out by his collar. The sound of Jordan delivering her cold ultimatum carried out into the grand foyer. Heavy, frantic footsteps echoed from the top of the sweeping marble staircase. Monique rushed down the stairs, moving with a desperate, frantic energy. She wore a sheer silk robe over her expensive pajamas, her hair messy and wild. She clutched her lower stomach with both hands, leaning heavily against the ornate iron banister as she descended. Monique began to wail loudly, forcing massive fake tears to stream down her flushed cheeks. She stormed into the study and positioned herself right between Jordan and Calvin. She put on the performance of a lifetime, playing the role of the ultimate tragic victim. Monique screamed that the stress of this hostile takeover was destroying her physical health. She dramatically rubbed her belly and sobbed that Jordan was actively trying to kill her unborn child. She wailed that her innocent first baby was going to be born into poverty because of a jealous and vindictive aunt. The front door of the mansion had been left wide open by Harrison, and the loud, hysterical screams of Monique drifted out onto the quiet street. A few wealthy neighbors walking their purebred dogs stopped and peered curiously through the open doorway. Monique noticed the audience and escalated her performance immediately. She dragged herself toward the foyer, pointing a shaking finger at Jordan. She yelled for the neighbors to see the monster standing inside. She cried that her sister was an evil corporate thief who was throwing a heavily pregnant woman out onto the cold, unfeeling streets. Brenda rushed out of the morning room, hearing the loud commotion. She took one look at her golden daughter weeping on the marble floor and rushed to wrap her arms around her. Brenda hugged Monique tightly, pulling her against her chest and stroking her hair. Brenda turned her furious, tear-stained face toward Jordan. The matriarch unleashed a torrent of vile, horrific curses. She called Jordan a barren, unnatural woman who was simply acting out of deep, pathological jealousy. She screamed that Jordan was incapable of finding a man or having a child of her own, so she had decided to ruin the perfect family Monique was building. Brenda spat on the floor near the expensive leather shoes of her youngest daughter, declaring that Jordan was entirely dead to her and would burn for what she was doing to an innocent pregnant mother. Jordan stood perfectly still in the center of the grand foyer, absorbing the toxic assault without a single flinch. She did not raise her voice or try to defend herself against the horrific personal insults. Her breathing remained completely steady and relaxed. She simply watched the pathetic theatrical display with deep clinical fascination. When Brenda finally paused to catch her breath, Jordan slowly opened her leather briefcase for a second time. She reached inside and retrieved a sealed white envelope bearing the embossed logo of the most exclusive private fertility clinic in Atlanta. She walked calmly toward the small antique table near the front door and tossed the envelope onto the polished surface. She told her mother that she might want to read that before buying any more designer baby clothes. Jordan explained that when she initiated the hostile takeover of the logistics company, she ordered a comprehensive forensic audit of all family financial accounts to track where the stolen assets were bleeding out. She noticed a massive, unexplained discrepancy in the personal retirement portfolio belonging to Brenda. Jordan exposed the entire disgusting truth with zero emotion. She stated that the medical report inside that envelope proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that Monique was absolutely not pregnant. She had never been pregnant. The entire room fell into a sudden, suffocating silence. Jordan continued outlining the sinister scam. She revealed that Monique and Spencer were drowning in secret personal debts long before the corporate collapse. Monique had gone online and purchased fake ultrasound documents and falsified medical records. She had spent the last 6 months wearing padded clothing and faking morning sickness to manipulate the emotional vulnerability of Brenda. Monique used the fake pregnancy to force her mother to withdraw hundreds of thousands of dollars from her protected retirement funds. Brenda believed she was helping secure a beautiful luxury condo with a massive nursery for her future grandchild. Instead, Monique and Spencer used the stolen retirement cash to pay off their aggressive underground gambling debts and secure a penthouse entirely in their own names. Jordan looked directly at her sister and stated that there was no baby, there was only a greedy parasite sucking her own mother dry. Brenda let go of the shoulders of Monique, stepping backward as if she had just been burned. Her hands shook violently as she reached for the white envelope on the antique table. She ripped it open and scanned the official clinic documents, her eyes darting back and forth across the undeniable medical proof. The devastating reality of the deep deception settled over her features, turning her sorrow into explosive, violent rage. Brenda raised her right arm and delivered a resounding, brutal slap directly across the face of Monique. The sharp crack echoed loudly through the entire foyer. Monique stumbled backward, clutching her stinging red cheek in absolute shock. But the rare moment of clarity did not last for the matriarch. Instead of turning to Jordan with apologies or gratitude, Brenda completely twisted the narrative in her sick mind. She spun around and faced Jordan, her eyes wide with irrational fury. Brenda blamed Jordan for exposing the ugly truth and permanently shaming the family in front of the watching neighbors. She screamed that Jordan should have kept her mouth shut and let them deal with it in private instead of destroying their peaceful home. She blindly blamed the messenger for the crime. Calvin stomped out of the study, his chest heaving like a wounded, desperate animal. He stepped over the scattered papers and growled with a deep, guttural hatred. He pointed his finger at Jordan and declared that she had not won the war. He stated that despite the financial freeze, he still legally held the majority voting power on the corporate board of directors. He swore that he would rally his loyal allies at the emergency shareholder meeting tomorrow morning and completely reverse the hostile takeover. The morning sun beat down on the towering glass exterior of the logistics company headquarters in downtown Atlanta. Calvin stood at the head of the massive polished oak table in the executive boardroom. He wore his most intimidating dark navy suit and gripped the thick edge of the table with white knuckles. 14 senior board members sat in high-backed leather chairs around the perimeter of the room. These were men and women Calvin had personally selected decades ago. They were his loyal foot soldiers in the corporate world. Calvin projected absolute confidence as he looked around the silent room. He cleared his throat and launched into a grand sweeping speech about family legacy and corporate loyalty. He spoke passionately about the decades they had spent building this empire from a single dusty warehouse into a national logistics powerhouse. His voice boomed off the expensive soundproof walls as he warned them about the aggressive hostile takeover orchestrated by a rogue element. He conveniently left out the humiliating fact that the rogue element was his own estranged daughter. Calvin urged the senior members to stand united against Horizon Equity. He pounded his heavy fist on the table, demanding their absolute loyalty in the upcoming emergency vote. He reminded them of the immense wealth he had brought them and the massive holiday bonuses he had personally approved over the years. Calvin felt a supreme sense of security radiating through his chest. He was absolutely certain that he still controlled 60% of the voting shares through proxy agreements and historical family alliances. He smiled a tight, arrogant smile, fully believing that this minor corporate rebellion would be crushed long before their catered lunch arrived. He promised the board that once they voted to block the hostile acquisition, he would personally ensure that Horizon Equity was dismantled and its founders prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. He looked at the familiar faces of his executives, expecting to see fervent nods of agreement and fiery determination. Instead, the room remained uncomfortably quiet. The senior executives shifted in their expensive leather chairs and actively avoided his piercing gaze. Calvin ignored their strange hesitation, chalking it up to the shock of the hostile takeover attempt. He loudly declared that the voting session would commence immediately and that their combined power would send a clear, permanent message to anyone who dared attack their empire. Before Calvin could call for the official corporate vote, the heavy frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom swung wide open. The sudden movement sucked all the air right out of the tense room. Jordan walked through the doorway with the slow, calculated pace of an apex predator circling its trapped prey. She wore a striking crimson suit that contrasted sharply with the bleak gray walls of the corporate office. Harrison walked exactly one step behind her, carrying his signature leather briefcase. Jordan did not pause or ask for permission to enter the highly restricted space. She walked the entire length of the massive oak table, her designer heels clicking loudly and rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. She bypassed the empty guest chairs and moved directly to the opposite end of the boardroom. She pulled out the oversized leather chair, traditionally reserved for the chairman of the board, and sat down. She crossed her legs and folded her hands, resting them perfectly on the polished wood. Calvin felt his blood pressure skyrocket to incredibly dangerous levels. His face turned a deep, mottled red as he stared at his youngest daughter occupying his sacred seat of power. He exploded in a fit of violent, uncontrollable rage. He slammed both of his hands on the table and screamed at her to get out of his building immediately. When Jordan simply offered a cold, calm smile, Calvin lost all his remaining composure. He turned wildly toward the heavy doors and barked angry orders at the two corporate security guards standing in the hallway. He demanded that they drag Jordan out of the building by sheer force and throw her onto the hot pavement outside. He shouted that she was trespassing on private property and criminally threatening a closed corporate proceeding. The burly security guard stepped forward but abruptly stopped at the threshold of the room. They looked right past Calvin and made direct eye contact with Jordan. Jordan gave them a tiny, almost imperceptible nod of dismissal. The heavily built guards immediately stepped backward and quietly closed the frosted glass doors, leaving Calvin completely isolated. Calvin turned back to his loyal board members, demanding that someone call the local police. Not a single person moved a muscle. The 14 senior executives sat completely frozen in their chairs. They kept their heads down, staring intently at the wood grain of the table or inspecting their own hands. Nobody reached for a cell phone. Nobody stood up to defend their furious boss. The absolute silence in the room was entirely deafening. Calvin looked frantically from face to face, his arrogant facade beginning to crack under the heavy weight of their profound silence. He suddenly realized he was standing completely alone in a room full of his supposed allies. Jordan leaned forward in the plush chairman's seat and let the heavy silence stretch for another agonizing minute. She watched her father sweat under the bright fluorescent lights. Then she casually reached into her briefcase and pulled out a massive stack of thick legal files bound by heavy black clips. She tossed the heavy stack onto the center of the table. The files slid smoothly across the polished oak and came to a stop right in front of Calvin. Jordan spoke with a voice as smooth and cold as polished steel. She told Calvin that his inspiring speech about loyalty and family legacy was incredibly moving, but entirely useless. She instructed him to open the files and look at the newly updated shareholder registry. Calvin grabbed the files with trembling hands and ripped them open. His eyes darted wildly across the pages as he tried to comprehend the dense legal text and the signatures listed at the bottom. Jordan did not wait for him to finish reading the devastating documents. She loudly revealed the brutal truth to the entire room. She announced that she had spent the last 72 hours quietly visiting the private homes of every single board member sitting at this very table. She explained that she did not need to fight Calvin for his personal shares because she had simply bought out his entire board of directors. Jordan revealed that she had aggressively purchased 51% of the total voting shares directly from his most trusted senior executives. She told Calvin that his loyal foot soldiers were absolutely sick and tired of his dictatorial management style and his reckless spending. They were totally exhausted by his immense arrogance and his stubborn refusal to adapt to modern technology. They were terrified of the massive hidden debts he had accumulated just to fund his lavish suburban lifestyle. When Jordan offered them a premium cash buyout from Horizon Equity, they all eagerly signed their voting shares away without a second thought. They happily chose financial security over a sinking ship piloted by a completely delusional madman. Calvin dropped the papers as if they were literally on fire. He looked at his longtime friends and business partners, feeling the ultimate sting of total betrayal. Jordan stood up from her chair and buttoned her crimson suit jacket. She looked her father dead in the eye and delivered the final corporate blow. She announced that as the new majority shareholder of the logistics empire, she was calling for an immediate vote of no confidence. With the silent backing of the entire room, Jordan officially stripped Calvin of his chief executive officer title right there at the table. She declared that he was no longer in charge of the company he had built, and he was officially terminated effective immediately. The devastating reality of his immediate termination hung heavy in the stifling boardroom air. Calvin stared down at the polished oak table, his chest rising and falling with rapid, shallow breaths as he tried to process the total destruction of his corporate empire. Then a low, dark chuckle began to rumble deep within his throat. The chuckle grew into a cold, sinister laugh that made the silent board members shift uncomfortably in their leather chairs. Calvin slowly stood up straight, smoothing the lapels of his dark navy suit. The panic and desperation vanished from his face, replaced entirely by a look of absolute calculated malice. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a slim, crisp manila folder. He tossed it onto the table with a flick of his wrist. He looked directly at Jordan and grinned, showing all his teeth. He told his daughter that she was incredibly smart, but she had forgotten one very crucial detail about her own rise to power. Calvin proudly declared that the core proprietary algorithm powering Horizon Equity was not entirely her own creation. He stated loudly that she had developed the initial source code for her massive financial empire 6 years ago, while she was still living under his roof and tinkering on a computer purchased with family company funds. Calvin claimed that because she used his corporate resources to build the foundation of her private equity fund, the family business legally owned the intellectual property. He tapped the manila folder and announced that it contained a massive federal copyright infringement lawsuit. He declared that he had already filed the paperwork to place a total hard freeze on all of her personal and corporate assets. He growled that she might have bought his board, but he was going to take her entire empire straight down to hell with him. The very next morning, the heavy oak doors of the downtown commercial courthouse swung shut, sealing Jordan and her family inside the tense legal arena. Calvin sat at the petitioner's table flanked by 3 highly expensive corporate lawyers wearing immaculate tailored suits. He looked incredibly smug, adjusting his silk tie and leaning back in his chair with the arrogant confidence of a man who believed he held all the winning cards. His lead attorney stepped up to the wooden podium and immediately launched a vicious, aggressive attack against Jordan. The lawyer presented a thick binder of supposedly official corporate invoices to the stern judge. He wove a massive, complex lie claiming that Jordan had used the logistics company multi-million-dollar servers and highly expensive proprietary software licenses to write the core algorithm for Horizon Equity 6 years ago. He painted Jordan as a deceitful junior employee who stole massive amounts of company property to build her own private financial empire behind her father back. Calvin nodded solemnly, playing the role of the deeply betrayed patriarch who had generously provided his ungrateful daughter with every technological resource she needed. The high-priced lawyers argued that because she utilized corporate equipment purchased with family funds, the intellectual property of Horizon Equity legally belonged to Calvin and his logistics company. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew incredibly heavy and tense as the judge carefully reviewed the forged documents. The judge frowned and leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. He looked directly at Jordan and stated that corporate intellectual property law was incredibly strict regarding the use of company resources. The judge began to lean heavily toward Calvin, signaling that he was fully prepared to grant the emergency injunction and freeze every single asset connected to Horizon Equity. Calvin flashed a wicked, triumphant smirk across the center aisle, believing he had finally trapped his brilliant daughter and successfully stolen her entire $3 billion empire right out from under her. Harrison did not look nervous or intimidated as he slowly stood up from the defense table. The towering attorney smoothed his charcoal suit jacket and calmly approached the bench, carrying a simple black flash drive and a stack of heavily bound forensic digital audits. He completely destroyed the massive lie in less than 2 minutes. Harrison spoke with a crystal-clear, commanding voice that cut straight through the tense courtroom air. He presented independent digital coding timestamps and immutable server logs retrieved directly from the original hosting company. He systematically dismantled the false narrative created by the expensive lawyers. He proved with absolute, undeniable technical certainty that Jordan did not use a single piece of corporate equipment to build her financial algorithm. Harrison painted the true, brutal picture of her early struggles. He revealed that Jordan wrote every single line of that complex code entirely from scratch on a completely beat-up second-hand laptop. He proved she did this while sitting alone at a wobbly table in a freezing, cheap studio apartment at 3 a.m. while her toxic family was busy cutting her off from all financial support. Harrison then turned his attention to the thick binder of invoices Calvin had submitted to the court. He pointed out massive, glaring flaws in the forged documents that the arrogant lawyers had entirely overlooked. He showed the judge that the serial numbers on the fake receipts belonged to server hardware models that did not even exist 6 years ago. He proved the software licenses listed were never actually purchased by the logistics company, but were fabricated just last night in a desperate attempt to steal her wealth. The pristine evidence presented by Calvin was brutally exposed as complete, undeniable garbage. The smug, triumphant smile instantly melted off the face of Calvin. He gripped the edge of the table as the judge glared furiously at the panic-stricken legal team for daring to submit blatantly fraudulent evidence into a federal commercial court. Harrison did not stop his relentless legal assault there. He turned away from the terrified lawyers and delivered the ultimate fatal blow to the entire family legacy. He reached into his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a massive stack of original, unedited financial reports. He announced to the stunned courtroom that these were the genuine internal accounting files Jordan had legally uncovered during her hostile takeover of the logistics empire. Harrison explained that since Horizon Equity now owned the entire company, they had absolute legal access to over 10 years of private corporate financial history. He placed the explosive files directly in front of the judge, revealing a massive, deeply entrenched systemic tax evasion scheme. Harrison systematically detailed how Calvin had been aggressively skimming millions of dollars from his own corporate accounts for over a decade. He proved that Calvin deliberately reported massive phantom losses to avoid paying corporate taxes, while simultaneously funneling the stolen cash into highly illegal offshore accounts. Furthermore, Harrison exposed the existence of a massive secret slush fund set up directly under the personal name of Brenda. He revealed that Calvin and Brenda used this ghost account to completely hide their immense illegal wealth from federal regulators. They had used the stolen corporate cash to fund their ridiculously lavish suburban lifestyle, purchasing luxury cars and designer wardrobes without paying a single cent in personal or corporate taxes. The entire courtroom let out a collective gasp as the sheer, staggering scale of the financial crimes was laid bare on the official legal record. Brenda, who was sitting in the front row of the visitor gallery, let out a horrified, piercing shriek. She covered her face with her trembling hands as she realized her own name was permanently attached to a massive federal financial crime. Calvin began to sweat profusely, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as his entire fraudulent life was completely exposed to the unforgiving light of the justice system. The judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel down against the sounding block with a violent crack that echoed like a gunshot in the silent courtroom. He was absolutely furious at the blatant deception and the arrogant forgery presented by Calvin and his highly paid legal team. The judge immediately threw out the copyright infringement lawsuit, completely dismissing the desperate asset freeze with extreme prejudice. He announced loudly that the commercial court would absolutely not tolerate perjury or the submission of fraudulent financial filings from anyone, regardless of their supposed corporate status. But the wrath of the judge did not stop there. He looked directly down at the sweating, trembling patriarch and declared that the court was legally obligated to take immediate action regarding the newly revealed evidence. The judge announced that he was personally forwarding the entire stack of tax evasion files and the illegal slush fund evidence directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS. He warned Calvin that federal agents would likely be knocking on his door before the end of the business day. Calvin gasped for air, grasping the fabric over his chest as the terrifying reality of federal prison finally set in. He collapsed heavily forward onto the polished defense table, his legs giving out completely beneath him. The once mighty patriarch was utterly broken and defeated by his own boundless greed. Brenda wept uncontrollably in the gallery, rocking back and forth as she realized her precious country club life was permanently over. They had absolutely nowhere left to run and no one left to manipulate. The crisp morning sunlight poured through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the sprawling downtown penthouse, illuminating the incredibly expensive modern art decorating the pristine walls. Jordan stood perfectly still near the heavy glass wall, looking out over the sprawling city she now essentially owned lock, stock, and barrel. The private elevator chimed softly, signaling an uninvited and highly unusual arrival. The polished steel doors slid open with a quiet hum, and Brenda stepped into the luxurious marble foyer. She looked completely different from the arrogant, screeching matriarch who had caused a massive, chaotic scene in the federal commercial courtroom just yesterday afternoon. Her incredibly expensive designer clothes were heavily wrinkled, and her perfectly styled blonde hair was flat and completely lifeless. Brenda walked slowly across the expensive hardwood floor, her eyes darting nervously around the magnificent, sprawling penthouse that far exceeded the grandeur and scale of her own lost suburban mansion. She dropped her heavy leather handbag onto a sleek glass coffee table and let out a long, trembling, exhausted sigh. She completely abandoned her usual toxic facade and immediately adopted the pathetic, submissive posture of a broken, terrified mother who had finally run out of options. Brenda fell heavily to her knees right in front of Jordan and began to sob hysterically, letting thick black mascara run down her pale face. She reached out with aggressively shaking hands and desperately grabbed the hem of her daughter's perfectly tailored charcoal suit jacket. She pleaded with Jordan to remember the sacred biological blood ties that eternally bound their family together through thick and thin. She cried loud, pathetic tears, claiming that she had carried Jordan in her womb and raised her from a helpless, innocent infant, giving her life and shelter. Brenda begged her youngest daughter to call off the ruthless federal agents and withdraw the devastating IRS tax evasion files before Calvin was violently dragged away to a miserable maximum security federal prison. She wailed that the massive public financial scandal was completely destroying their lives and making them absolute social pariahs in their elite, wealthy community. She begged Jordan to just return the family mansion and let them keep a tiny shred of their former dignity and generational wealth. Brenda swore up and down that things would be completely different now and promised that they could finally be a real, loving, cohesive family if Jordan would just show a little bit of mercy today. She poured every ounce of her remaining dramatic energy into the emotional performance, hoping to aggressively manipulate the basic human empathy she wrongly assumed her daughter still possessed. She looked up with eyes full of fake maternal desperation, waiting for Jordan to break down crying and forgive them for decades of relentless, severe psychological torture. Jordan did not move a single muscle as her mother wept pitifully on the expensive Persian rug. She looked down at the pathetic woman clutching her expensive suit jacket and felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical detachment. She slowly reached down and peeled the trembling, sweaty fingers off her pristine clothing, one by one, showing no gentleness whatsoever. She took a deliberate, measured step backward, putting physical and emotional distance between them. Jordan spoke with a voice completely devoid of any warmth, affection, or basic human forgiveness. She told Brenda to save the theatrical fake tears because they were entirely wasted in this room, and she was immune to such pathetic manipulation. She calmly reminded her mother of the brutal, horrific night of her 18th birthday when her entire world was shattered. She painted a highly vivid picture of the exact moment Calvin had cornered her in the massive family kitchen and called her a worthless, pathetic mistake who would never amount to anything in the real world. Jordan recounted exactly how her father had maliciously crushed her dreams of going to a prestigious university by refusing to sign her financial aid forms out of pure, unadulterated spite and a need for absolute control. She stared directly into the frantic, panicking eyes of her weeping mother and highlighted the absolute most painful part of that dark foundational memory. Brenda had been standing right there, leaning casually against the cold marble counter, sipping a glass of incredibly expensive red wine, while her daughter was emotionally decimated. Brenda had watched her husband verbally destroy their youngest child, and she had not said a single solitary word in her defense. Jordan explained that Brenda always chose her own luxurious comfort and financial security over protecting her own vulnerable daughter from monstrous abuse. She stated firmly that enabling abuse through cowardice and silence was exactly the same as throwing the physical punches yourself. Jordan declared that sacred blood ties were never an excuse for relentless cruelty, and they certainly did not grant a free pass for decades of severe emotional neglect. She told Brenda that family was supposed to fiercely protect each other, But the only thing Brenda ever protected was her own delicate social status and her pristine elite country club membership. She totally refused to withdraw the federal tax files or hand back the shiny keys to the mansion because those devastating consequences were the direct result of their own limitless criminal greed and moral rot. She made it absolutely clear that she owed them zero mercy today, because they had never shown her a single ounce of grace when she was starving and struggling to survive on the unforgiving, harsh streets. The fake tears instantly dried up on the face of the defeated matriarch as the harsh rejection registered in her brain. Brenda realized her desperate emotional manipulation was completely failing to penetrate the thick, impenetrable armor her daughter had built over the hard years. The pathetic sobbing stopped abruptly, and the familiar ugly mask of toxic superiority slid right back over her aging features. She slowly stood up from the expensive rug and smoothed down her wrinkled designer dress with stiff, angry, jerky movements. Her eyes narrowed into dark, dangerous slits as she glared at the powerful billionaire daughter she could no longer control or abuse with impunity. Brenda reached deep into her heavy leather handbag and pulled out a thick yellow file folder packed with loose papers. She slammed it down onto the glass coffee table with a vicious, heavy thud that rattled the expensive decorations. She told Jordan that if she wanted to play aggressive hardball, then the entire family would go down in spectacular, burning flames together. Brenda revealed her true, venomous nature, outlining a completely fabricated and highly malicious public smear campaign she had spent the entire night preparing with a sleazy private investigator. She claimed the thick folder contained dozens of fake witness testimonies and heavily forged digital photographs designed to completely ruin a life. She threatened to take this dirty blackmail file directly to the largest local media network in the city, where she still had a few powerful social connections. She told Jordan she was going to sell an exclusive, highly sensationalized story, framing the brilliant young corporate leader as a massive, pathetic fraud who stole her way to the top. Brenda threatened to tell the eager, hungry press that Jordan only secured her initial startup seed money by sleeping with elderly, corrupt billionaires and maliciously manipulating vulnerable, older investors. She promised to spread horrific, vicious rumors that Horizon Equity was nothing but a massive illegal Ponzi scheme built entirely on stolen funds and illicit bedroom favors. Brenda sneered that the local media network absolutely loved a juicy corporate scandal, and they would broadcast the vile, disgusting story on every single television screen in the state. She promised to completely obliterate the pristine, professional reputation Jordan had worked so tirelessly to build from nothing. She told her daughter that the resulting public relations nightmare would trigger massive federal investigations into her own company and scare away every single legitimate wealthy investor she had acquired. Brenda crossed her arms over her chest and issued her final toxic, unhinged ultimatum. She demanded that Jordan hand over the deeds to the mansion and transfer $10 million into an untraceable offshore account by noon, or the fake story would hit the evening news and destroy her life forever. Jordan threw her head back and let out a loud, genuine burst of laughter that seemed completely out of place given the severe threat. The bright melodic sound echoed off the high ceilings of the massive penthouse, thoroughly confusing the arrogant matriarch. Brenda frowned deeply, unsure why her devastating world-ending threat was being treated like a hilarious, harmless joke by her usually serious daughter. Jordan casually walked over to the sleek modern media console and picked up a heavy silver remote control. She turned toward the massive flat-screen television mounted on the far wall and pressed a single button to turn it on. The large screen flashed to life, instantly tuning into the exact local media network Brenda had just threatened to use for her vile smear campaign. The morning news anchor was sitting at a large curved desk, reading from a digital prompter with a look of extreme, palpable excitement. A massive red breaking news banner scrolled rapidly across the bottom of the bright, high-definition television screen. The bold white letters announced a historic, unprecedented corporate media buyout in the city. The anchor excitedly reported that the entire broadcasting network and all its affiliated digital publications had just been purchased in a massive overnight cash acquisition. The glowing metallic corporate logo of Horizon Equity completely filled the screen behind the news anchor, solidifying the monumental purchase. Jordan paused the television, freezing the image of her own massive corporate logo, broadcasting across the entire state. She tossed the silver remote onto the glass coffee table right next to the pathetic yellow blackmail file. She looked Brenda dead in the eye with absolute chilling dominance. She invited her mother to march right down to the busy broadcasting studio and hand her fabricated story directly to the chief editor. She told Brenda to go ahead and see if her newly acquired employees would ever dare to publish a filthy smear piece against their own billionaire boss. The sheer magnitude of the absolute financial power Jordan wielded finally crashed down on the toxic matriarch, destroying her last shred of hope. The realization that she could not even use the press to destroy her daughter completely shattered her fragile, desperate mind. Brenda stared at the frozen television screen, her mouth opening and closing in silent, absolute horror, as she realized she was entirely trapped in a world that her banished daughter now completely owned. The massive iron gates of the lavish suburban mansion stood wide open, but there was no luxury to be found on the sprawling estate today. A beat-up yellow moving truck was parked awkwardly on the pristine circular driveway, leaking dark oil onto the expensive cobblestones. Calvin struggled down the grand marble front steps, carrying a cheap cardboard box filled with the few personal items the federal agents allowed him to keep. He wore a faded, wrinkled shirt, and his face was drawn and haggard, completely stripped of his former arrogant corporate glory. Brenda followed closely behind him, dragging a frayed plastic trash bag stuffed with generic clothing. She was openly sobbing and complaining loudly about the brutal unfairness of their situation. Monique stumbled out the front door, holding a small, pathetic stack of outdated fashion magazines and whining that her entire life was ruined. The three of them immediately began to viciously argue with each other right there on the driveway. Brenda screamed at Calvin for his careless, illegal tax schemes that cost them their beautiful country club lifestyle. Calvin shouted back that Brenda spent millions of dollars on useless designer garbage and helped dig their massive financial grave. Monique threw her magazines on the ground and blamed both of her parents for completely destroying her future and leaving her utterly penniless. They were a pathetic picture of a toxic family, finally turning on each other when the money dried up. Through the open window of the cheap moving truck, a small portable radio broadcasted the midday local news. The stern voice of the news anchor announced the final verdict in a massive corporate fraud trial. The anchor reported that Spencer had officially received a severe 5-year sentence in federal prison for his direct role in attempting to blackmail a prominent local billionaire and for fabricating highly malicious evidence. Brenda flinched visibly when she heard the news about her sleazy private investigator, realizing that she had barely escaped sharing a cramped federal prison cell with him. She looked around the barren driveway, realizing that this cheap rental truck and a tiny rundown apartment across the city were her new permanent reality. The three toxic family members loaded their sad, pathetic boxes into the back of the rusted truck without speaking another word to each other, as their former neighbors watched the humiliating spectacle from their manicured lawns. Just a short distance down the quiet tree-lined street, a sleek black luxury vehicle sat silently idling near the curb. Jordan sat in the spacious plush leather back seat, dressed in a flawless tailored emerald suit. She slowly pressed a button on the door panel, and the dark-tinted window rolled down with a soft mechanical hum. She sat perfectly still and watched the absolute total collapse of the arrogant people who had once violently crushed her spirit and told her she would never amount to anything. She watched her mother struggle to lift a heavy plastic bag into the dirty rental truck while ruining her last pair of expensive shoes. She watched her spoiled golden sister throw a pathetic temper tantrum on the beautiful landscaping because she could not fit all her useless shoes in the truck. She watched the man who used to terrorize her daily, now looking incredibly small and weak as he wiped greasy sweat from his forehead. Calvin turned his heavy head toward the street, and his sunken, tired eyes locked directly onto the sleek black car. He recognized Jordan sitting quietly in the back seat, and his entire body seemed to freeze in place. He stared at his incredibly successful billionaire daughter, and his face crumpled with absolute belated regret and profound, utter defeat. He took a hesitant, shaky step toward the street, perhaps wanting to beg for one final scrap of mercy, or offer a pathetic, useless apology for everything he had done. Jordan did not move a single muscle, and her beautiful face remained completely blank. She felt absolutely zero anger and zero sadness toward the broken man standing on the driveway. The burning, fiery rage that had driven her for so many long years had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but cold, peaceful clarity. She realized that these toxic, miserable people simply did not matter to her anymore. They were no longer the terrifying monsters of her childhood, but just a group of pathetic, greedy strangers dealing with the harsh, natural consequences of their own cruel actions. Jordan held the gaze of Calvin for one more brief moment before she calmly reached out and pressed the button on her door panel. The dark-tinted windows smoothly rolled back up, completely severing her from their toxic world forever. She leaned back into the comfortable leather seat and quietly ordered her driver to take her back to the city. The powerful luxury vehicle pulled away from the curb, leaving the ruined family choking on its dust and facing their bleak, miserable future alone. The afternoon sun flooded through the massive glass walls of the newly renovated chief executive office at the top of the downtown corporate tower. Jordan stood behind a massive modern desk made of sleek reclaimed wood and brushed steel. She looked down at a thick stack of official corporate restructuring documents waiting for her final authorization. She picked up a heavy gold fountain pen and smoothly signed her name at the bottom of the final page. With that single elegant stroke, she officially dissolved the old logistics company and completely erased the toxic legacy of Calvin from the corporate world forever. She integrated the massive shipping infrastructure directly into the Horizon equity portfolio, completely modernizing the entire outdated operation from the ground up. Jordan directed her engineering teams to implement her brilliant proprietary artificial intelligence algorithms across the entire global supply chain network. The brilliant new system immediately optimized shipping routes, slashed operational costs, and completely eliminated the massive systemic fraud that her father had relied on for decades to fund his lavish lifestyle. She took a rotting, corrupt empire and transformed it into a clean, highly efficient modern powerhouse. But Jordan did not stop at simply maximizing her massive corporate profits and expanding her financial dominance. She pressed a button on her desk intercom and called her senior public relations director into the spacious office. She proudly announced the immediate creation of a massive multi-million-dollar educational initiative fully funded by her private personal wealth. She instructed her team to establish a permanent comprehensive scholarship fund, specifically dedicated to supporting and uplifting young Black women pursuing advanced degrees in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Jordan remembered the cold, lonely nights she spent writing complex code on a broken laptop with absolutely no financial support or encouragement from her own family. She was fiercely determined to make sure that other brilliant, ambitious young women would never have to struggle and fight through the same dark, lonely barriers she had faced. She allocated millions of dollars to ensure these young women would receive full tuition housing and direct corporate mentorship from her own top executive leaders. Jordan smiled as she looked out over the sprawling city skyline, feeling a profound sense of absolute, authentic victory. She had successfully taken the dark, miserable legacy of her abuser and forcefully transmuted it into a powerful beacon of real, tangible value for her community. Several months later, the crisp chill of late November settled over the sprawling suburban estate. The old family mansion had been completely gutted and beautifully renovated under the direct personal supervision of Jordan. The dark, oppressive walls had been knocked down and replaced with bright, open spaces that welcomed the warm autumn light. A massive, beautiful dining table stretched across the center of the grand room, covered in a magnificent traditional Thanksgiving feast. Jordan sat gracefully at the head of the table, wearing a stunning, simple dress and a warm, genuine smile. She looked around the crowded room and did not see a single toxic blood relative anywhere in sight. Instead, she was surrounded by the beautiful, brilliant, chosen family she had built from scratch over the years. Her brilliant corporate attorneys, her loyal software engineers, and the fiercely dedicated friends who had stood right by her side when she had absolutely nothing were all laughing and sharing stories. The large room was filled with the beautiful musical sound of authentic love and mutual respect. Harrison sat near her right side, telling a hilarious story about a recent corporate acquisition, while the chief technology officer passed a massive bowl of roasted vegetables down the large table. Jordan gently tapped her silver spoon against the side of her crystal wine glass, and the room slowly quieted down to listen. She stood up and raised her glass, looking at the wonderful people who truly saw her value and supported her brilliant mind through every challenge. She offered a brief, heartfelt toast to new beginnings and the incredible, unstoppable power of chosen family. Jordan took a slow sip of her sweet wine, feeling completely at peace in her own home. She realized in that beautiful golden moment that the absolute sweetest revenge was not destruction, but simply living a brilliant and completely free life. True security and self-worth can never be inherited from or validated by a toxic family. They must be forged through your own independence and resilience. When the people who are supposed to love and protect you unconditionally choose their own comfort, pride, and greed over your well-being, walking away is not a failure. It is the ultimate act of self-respect. The most profound revenge against those who consistently tear you down is not found in their destruction, but in building a brilliant, fiercely independent life where their toxic opinions no longer matter. You are the architect of your own empire. Share your own story in the comments below if you have ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to build your own success and find your true worth.